Okay.
There we go.
So I may turn the video off because sometimes it slows down sometimes it slows down the signal, but let's see how it goes.
That's okay. Yeah, I think we just move along as we go. However, if it works, we do it. Otherwise, I think that most listeners are going to use the audio anyways. For us, it's just nice kind of to have, some people are still more YouTube people, others are more audio people. We just want to reach as big an audience as possible. Well, I did your introduction, a little bit of your introduction online that we're going to play, but I would really like to begin a little bit with you talking about yourself, what you do, what Mexican Reporter is about, because I think Latin America and Mexico in particular is a topic that, especially in Europe, is not getting as much attention as it should. So it would be nice kind of to hear a little bit from your perspective as a reporter and somebody from the region, what's going on and how you became a journalist and why you work on the topics that you're working on.
Okay, well, I'm actually British Maltese, and I came here in 2006 with the intention to stay 3 months, and stayed a little longer. I arrived, in fact, just when the then Mexico President Calderon had just launched his drug war in inverted commas, which is technically a government crackdown on organized crime and drug trafficking. So I've seen that play out in the 12 years that I've been here, because it's still ongoing, as you know. And, Latin America, it's one of the most homicidal regions in the world. Certainly some of the countries here have some of the highest in the world for countries that aren't technically in the grips of a war. And there are perennial issues that affect nearly every country, like corruption, and like I said, homicides. And of course, it's also home to where the three only countries in the world where cocaine is produced en masse, which is Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. So the international cocaine trade all starts here, and of course is aided and abetted by such high levels of corruption. And Mexico is caught right in the middle of that, because it's, Mexico is right between the United States, which is the biggest recreational drug market in the world, and some of the biggest producing countries. So obviously there are a lot of dynamics playing out in the region. And the drug trade, among other factors, which I think are more cultural, have kind of contributed to this perennial corruption, which is affecting governance and affecting elections, and all the other problems that go with it. I think maybe the reason, I do feel that Latin America does get a decent amount of attention from European media. It could be more. And obviously, another big issue that's been affecting the region recently, which has been of more interest to European media, I think, because it's a change from the usual narrative about violence and drugs, has been this massive migration crisis that has spilled over in the last 5 years. So we have people, Central America hemorrhaging people who are trying to get to the United States, and also Venezuela under the government of Nicolas Maduro, which has, over the last 2 or 3 years, I think, seen at least 2 million people leave in search of something better. And of course, those migration flows are having a big impact on the region. You're also seeing people coming from Africa who would usually go to Europe, but now that we have this perception that Europe's doors are closing to immigrants, they're making this epic journey across Latin America into usually Brazil or Ecuador, and then making that journey up through Central America all the way to the border with the United States. So for the first time, Mexico started seeing Black Africans moving across Mexico. It started, 3 or 4 years ago. We'd never seen those migration flows before. So there is a lot happening in the region. I have had a lot of interest from European media in terms of the migration crisis, and they do pay attention to the drug war. But I think because things have been going on for such a long time, just yesterday, 13 police officers were shot and killed in an ambush in Michoacan, which is one of the southern, more violent states in the country. Yes, it did make the headlines, but I think for better or for worse, editors have now become accustomed to these very high levels of violence because they've been going on for a really long time across the region.
Do you think that the people tend to be aware of the numbers? There has been, since the official drug war started, and very often the date that is given is 2006. I tried to look up the numbers. The different ones. The International Institute for Strategic Studies talks about 130,000 killed since 2006. The Wall Street Journal puts the number at least 250,000. So we're talking about more than 10,000 casualties per year. And if we compare this, for example, to the US war on terror, the overall casualties since 2001 have been approximately 8,000. So what's going on? Basically, Mexico is losing per year what the United States have lost in the entire war on terror.
Well, it's very hard to dig into those figures in terms of how much of them are due to the drug trade, main or organized crime. And remember, criminal syndicates in Mexico, they don't just produce and traffic drugs. They're engaged in extortion, kidnapping, fuel theft is a huge source of profit for them too. So they have multiple criminal markets. But because the homicide rates are not divided into sort of organized crime-related homicide rates or drug-related homicide rates and other types of murders, which are also fairly commonplace, it's difficult to know how much of the insecurity comes down to those kinds of murders. Although I would argue that you have such high levels of violence in Mexico now, it has generated, firstly, an immunity on the part of society where it's normal for them to see pictures or images of people hanging from bridges, decapitated heads, people lying dead on the ground. This has become normal everyday. These have become normal everyday images for Mexicans. But what is also generated, I think, by such high levels of violence, which enjoys almost blanket impunity, 92% or over 90% of crimes in Mexico aren't investigated. What that has generated is this kind of climate of I can do what I want and get away with it. So I do think you have a lot of murders and violence taking place in Mexico, which are a result of that sort of free-for-all rather than being directly connected to organized crime. So if your neighbor and if your wife cheats on you with your neighbor, you can take matters in your own hands and kill someone, and it's likely you're going to get away with it because you know that the police aren't going to do anything about it. Now, that doesn't have anything to do directly with the drug trade, but this ongoing impunity and high levels of violence generates these other consequences, which in turn contribute to more violence, I think.
One article I read was titled that it's a civilizational crisis. Do you think, based on what you just told me, that this is kind of an accurate description? Kind of is hardening for everyday violence?
What do you mean civilization crisis?
And that institutions break down, or kind of these limits on being shocked by very graphic displays of violence. So as you just said, kind of the tendency to take matters in one's own hand, that kind of the limit to do so is much lower because it's such an everyday presence.
I think there are a lot of circumstances in which people do take matters into their own hands, not just in Mexico, but across the region. Just yesterday, I was reading a headline about in a town, a local mayor was tied to the back of a car and dragged around because he didn't come through on his promises to improve the infrastructure of the municipality. So I do think that's common. It's called lynching here. It happens across the region. Latin America is notorious for having very weak institutions, especially within the justice area and within elections. So there is a lot of corruption in terms of campaign financing. We've seen evidence recently of, he's about to leave the Guatemalan presidency, Jimmy Morales. We've seen evidence recently that he accepted financing for his presidential campaign from the Zetas, which is a very, very was a very drug trafficking group in Mexico. We're also seeing in Honduras, the president's brother is currently on trial for drug trafficking in the United States, and he's implicating his own brother, who's the sitting president of the United States. And obviously, the very high-profile trial of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who was recently sentenced to life in an American jail. A lot of the justice against these people is being seen out in the US. Why? Because a lot of Latin American countries do not have strong enough institutions to keep these people in jail and to carry out efficient trials. So I think institutional weakness has a huge amount to answer for. And then, yes, as you say, there are cultural factors that also kick in once, high levels of violence have been tolerated for a very long time. So I think there are a number of factors involved in why this situation is as it is, as well as the fact that, the government sort of proves itself incapable of really being able to bring things under control. So you've seen a country like Mexico and across the region, the militarization of the fight against drug trafficking. And, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Mexico's president, when he came into office at the end of last year, has said that that's going to be different, has said that the drug war is over. And yet you see the creation of a new militarized security force, in this case, the National Guard. And yet seizures of illicit drugs at the US-Mexico border continue to rise. Violence continues to rise. So clearly, this strategy is not having the desired effect. What's worrying is that there are no new ideas.
Do you think that, this has been discussed, and it's especially in the United States, less so, I think, on the part of Mexico, a reappearing topic. Would you think it would help to recognize the cartels as terrorist organizations, to really make it a counter-insurgency, counter-terrorist operation?
Honestly, I don't think so, because the drug cartels don't have an ideology. You have had certain groups that have religious associations. In Michoacán, there was a group called Los Templarios, the Knights Templar and whatever. But this is branding. This is not to do with an ideology that they have, unlike groups that we've seen surging in the Middle East and in Europe. And of course, you do have other terrorist groups in Latin America, but not in Mexico. The cartels are not terrorist groups in the sense that they are not operating because of an ideology. This is business. I would say that the cartels are a product of, brutal, the kind of brutal capitalist system that we've seen install itself. This is about money. This is about business. And I think the United States and countries in the region insist on attacking this problem from a supply side. So let's destroy the poppy fields, let's destroy the coca fields, let's try and replace coca and marijuana with avocados or with tomatoes. That's been ongoing for the last 2 or 3 decades, and yet we see more coca production in Colombia than ever before. We see more drugs trying to cross the border than ever before. So clearly, we need a new approach. The government in all countries would do well to ask itself, why do people want to consume drugs? Can we legalize them and tax them, which would certainly bring down the opioid overdoses that you're seeing in the United States right now? Because when people take illicit drugs, they do not know what's in them. And with substances like fentanyl, which you may or may not have heard of, which is a synthetic opioid, depending on the type it is, can be between 50 and 100 times stronger than heroin. This is now being sought out by addicts in the United States. And when you think about the fact that illicit forms of this drug are being cooked up in clandestine kitchens, it's very easy for deadly levels of it to be getting to users. And fentanyl is very, very easy to overdose on, and is in fact the biggest cause of overdoses in the United States right now. So there are lots of factors at play, but I think what I have seen in the last 12 years since I've been here is a repetition of the same strategies and the same ideas. And no, I don't think labeling the cartels terrorist organizations is going to make any difference. What we need to move towards is policies which decriminalize users, which aim to create legal drug industries of these substances that people so want. Because unless you eliminate demand in the United States as well as across Latin America, because there are huge drug markets in Latin America right now, Brazil, I think, being the biggest one. Unless you eliminate demand for those products, they will continue to come. And as long as they continue to be produced and transported, the cartels will continue to exist. So I think we need to try something new.
I mean, you mentioned initially the breakdown of institutions, or the limited role of institutions, the limited power of them, and also the idea of avocados. I think just recently there was even an article about the so-called avocado wars. So it seems that even in this area, if the institutions, the framework doesn't work, even something as innocent as an avocado might turn into almost like cartel-like conflicts. And as you said, it's business, just with this heavy undertone of violence.
Right, and that's already happening. That's already playing out in states around the region because organized crime based their power on territorial control. So if you control a state or a certain part of a state, you not only control drug plantations and manufacturing and transportation, but you control the extortion markets of all the local businesses in an industry such as the avocado industry, which is one of Mexico's most significant agricultural industries. In Michoacan, we have heard for years that the cartels are at least extorting these companies, if not directly involved in the cultivation and exportation of avocados themselves. So as territorial control grows, so do the criminal opportunities for these groups, because they aren't just committed to drugs. They're committed to generating profit through the use of violence. And I think that's only going to grow the more territorial control they have. Some would argue now that even if you took drugs out of their hands by creating legal industries, which of course takes years, they would continue to diversify into other criminal markets like fuel theft and extortion, which are huge sources of profits, at least in Mexico.
So even if the Mexican government would basically step in and say, we don't outlaw drugs, we just basically nationalize the industry and then have it regulated, and as you say, kind of in whatever directions it would be possible, that they would just shift to a different industry, to a different area, but they would continue to exist?
I think they would continue to exist. They would struggle because they would lose such a huge part of their profits and business. But what you've seen within organized crime in the region is it's incredibly agile and it recognizes what's coming. So in Mexico, for example, and across the region, when you saw this state level legalization of marijuana starting to happen in the United States, the cartels realized that marijuana was no longer going to be the cash crop that it has been for the last, since the 1970s, 1980s. So what happens? They start to diversify into cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl now. Methamphetamine and fentanyl are both synthetic substances that do not require farmers to plant plants. These substances can be produced in clandestine kitchens. You've seen the poppy industry start to go bust in Mexico as the popularity of other synthetic drugs has increased. But the cartels have been on top of that for years. They saw that coming years ago.
Are they exclusively produced in Mexico? Or is a lot of this also coming from China? Because that has been, I think, an argument in recent years that a lot of it is imported from China, and the cartels then kind of sell it and smuggle it to the United States.
In terms of methamphetamine, the precursors are imported from China, and then the drugs are cooked here and transported north. In the case of fentanyl, that's also the case. So China is the source of where a lot of these chemicals are coming from. But the cartels are a very important part of the chain increasingly, especially as the United States is now cracking down on the postal service, which allows a lot of fentanyl to come into the United States from China. So the role of Mexico is growing in that sense. So it's hard to know really what the organized crime panorama would look like in Mexico if you did take drugs out of their hands. But what I do know is that these organizations adapt. And if you took away a massive revenue source, they would probably find something else. I mean, if that happened and then the police and security forces no longer had to be focused on the drug trade, then arguably more resources would be put into these other criminal activities. But it's a hard one to call. But let's not forget, organized crime has existed pretty much since human life and civilization began. So when you put pressure or take away one thing, then they tend to adapt and find something else to help them to survive.
But so these cartels basically start running global supply chains like a multinational corporation. It's not just that they're produced in Mexico and extort from the local population. They import precursor products from China, assemble them, so to speak, in Mexico, and then do their main trade in the United States. So as you said before, they act business-like a multinational corporation.
Yeah. And it's not just the United States. They're huge suppliers to Europe. I mean, cocaine can only come from this region. There are increasing reports about their role in Australia and Asia, certainly in terms of wildlife trafficking. We've seen a lot of reports about the popularity of certain fish, the totuaba, which only lives in the Gulf of Mexico. The Chinese market has a real taste for the bladders of those fish because they believe they're a local delicacy. And so that fish is being illegally farmed and shipped to Asia. Whether the cartels are involved, there's only anecdotal evidence right now, but that's just another example of how illicit production and supply chains are absolutely global.
There's something you alluded a little bit at the beginning that I would like to go a little deeper. When you said that they don't have an ideology, right? What it seems to me that distinguishes the cartels from other organized crime or terrorist organizations is the Italian mafia, for example, is a criminal organization, but they kind of also have this social surrounding, right? This idea that they don't just extort, they also provide social services. They kind of almost bring an identity to the regions they're active. The same is true in the Islamic world, right? Where what is very often denoted as terrorist organizations, they also provide significant social services that they feel that their religion obliges them to provide. How do the cartels operate? Is it purely kind of a violence-based kind of extortion, or do they try to build loyalties and bonds with the local population as well?
Well, if you go to Sinaloa, and especially Badiraguato, which is the municipality that El Chapo comes from, if you ask around about him and his business associate, who is still at large, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, they speak very respectfully of these men because, for lots of reasons. I mean, for decades, they have been the providers of a way for families to make a living by tending small plots of poppies and marijuana, buying those products on a steady, regular basis. So there is that, I think, which varies depending on what states you go to in Mexico, but certainly they do have hero status or Robin Hood status in some parts of the country. Now add to that the fact that poverty is a huge problem in the region, and people who work for organized crime are perceived by some as having status and power. What you've seen here in Mexico, certainly in terms of the foot soldiers of the cartels, they're younger and younger. Young men are entering the cartels as young as 14 or 15 to kill, to work as lookouts, to help package drugs, transportation, and to be, the heavies, basically, fully knowing that they're unlikely to reach their 20th or 25th birthday. But for them, it's an opportunity to feel power, to satisfy ambition, in a country that very often is perceived as not providing decent education, decent employment opportunities. I do think Mexico is changing, and its economy, although things aren't great right now, but it is becoming more sophisticated. There are lots of growing industries here. Education is improving, but a lot of the time those things don't filter down to the people that they need to. So, organized crime is perceived as offering young people with a future of sorts, even if it's a short-term future. Obviously, there are some regional variations to that. Now, if you go to Central America, where you have what we call La Mara, so these are street gangs with which I'm sure people in Europe are familiar. They came up in the late 90s and the early 2000s as these young tattooed men, hyper violent criminal organizations, which have proliferated in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. These organizations have much more of a cultural value to them, in the sense that they provide a sense of belonging to impoverished, marginalized men from very poor parts of these countries. I mean, these countries are very impoverished, crippled by corruption, incredibly weak institutions, although we've seen some improvements in recent years. But the Mara, the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18, they do provide a sense of belonging to those young men, and to a certain extent women, but women tend not to have very hierarchical positions. In some of those countries, I believe in El Salvador, but check this, they have created terrorist laws, and they do identify those organizations as terrorist organizations, in part to give them more legislative power and more of a like legal framework in which to clamp down on them. Has it helped? I mean, again, those countries continue to be some of the most violent in the region, and I would argue that it increases this kind of hostility between a disenfranchised part of the population, which is now heavily criminalized and spreading to the United States, and a very kind of repressive government. These hard fist security strategies have been going for the last 20 years in Central America, and the problem is worse than it's ever been. So again, you have to ask yourself, is this us against them strategy the best way to pursue this problem? On top of that, you also have documented collusion between the gangs and business and political elites in these countries. So there is a double morale there, where you have, this kind of theater in which they're clamping down on these gangs, but behind the scenes, there is also a marriage of convenience between them, where the gangs, they have so much power and territorial control, they're often in collusion with elites to provide, to help provide support during elections, to provide pressure through violence where it's needed. So it's a very, very complex relationship and a complex problem to solve.
Well, this must be very discouraging also for the average police officer or the average soldier. If we say they're supposed to risk their lives in the fight against organized crime and the fight against the cartels, when they probably know that their superiors, or at least the superior of their superior, is probably paid or bribed by the very cartel that they are supposed to risk their lives fighting against.
Yeah, I mean, we have had some very genuine and sincere efforts, I think, to clean up the problem of corruption within security forces throughout the region. That's been ongoing in Honduras. Every Mexican president who's come into power in the last 12 years has tried to do so. So yes, they're also terribly badly paid, especially at a state and municipal level in Mexico. A lot of police don't make a realistic living wage, which encourages them to take bribes and encourages them to collude with organized crime. I mean, in many parts of the region, low-level police officers at the municipal level often act as the armed wing of criminal groups because it's extra income for them, but also in the reality in which it's difficult to say no. So a lot of them are surviving. And that's the same when it comes to all sorts of other trades in Mexico. Yes, they're co-opted, but they don't have much choice in a lot of circumstances. I mean, if you say no and they're going to kill you, is that really a choice? I mean, you do what you have to do to survive. So I'm not, it's not that, people who are part of Mexico's security forces are born bad people, but they're operating in a system that's rotten to the core and they have to survive. And that's why these problems persist. You see it also in journalism. I think the perception of violence against journalists in Mexico is a little black and white, a little oversimplified. And I think we have to be realistic about some of the power networks and relationships that develop when you have such powerful and influential and violent criminal organizations controlling huge swathes of the country. And when there is a nexus between politicians and business elites and, criminal syndicates.
Do you think that if you look at the future of Mexico, and the country seems a little bit bifurcated education for an external observer, right? You have areas like Monterrey or Tijuana, kind of very kind of modern Western way. If you go there as a tourist, you would not sense that a couple of miles out, something completely different, an almost different world is going on. So do you think that the future of Mexico, if things get better economically, education-wise, can be more like in these pockets of stability, or that this is still a far way out?
I think it's a long way off, and I think it has to be. It is not a solution that Mexico can create on its own. Mexico's relationship with the United States is a marriage which has, as all marriages do, good points and dysfunctional ones. And the United States' appetite for illegal drugs is implicitly a driver behind the situation that we're seeing in Mexico right now, as is the fact that I don't know how many, I would say at least 2/3 of the weapons used by organized crime in Mexico are bought in the United States and then smuggled down. So it's kind of a mutually dysfunctional relationship, in the sense that I think if you look at the rhetoric of President Donald Trump, he enjoys vilifying Mexico and the cartels and their role in the levels of overdoses we're seeing in the United States and the drug trade. But really, the United States has as much to answer for the state of affairs than as Mexico does. And until Americans stop buying drugs and selling guns, I can't see a way that this is going to get better. I do think that it's also about building strong institutions, combating corruption, empowering civil society in Mexico to really be able to control their environments and their destiny, which is to do with poverty alleviation, political empowerment, access to justice. These are all huge tasks in which hundreds of thousands of people on both sides of the border have long been working. And obviously things aren't going to change overnight, but like I said, the drive of supply and demand when it comes to the drug trade has been there since time began and will continue to be there. And so we have to take a more realistic approach to what dynamics criminalizing that industry is having in the region, and whether taking a different approach might improve things. I mean, Mexico is moving towards legalizing and creating a legal marijuana trade. I would argue that marijuana has long not been a cash cow for the cartels. So I don't think that's going to have a huge impact on the levels of violence that we're seeing now. The big cash cows for the cartels continue to be cocaine, methamphetamine, increasingly fentanyl, and the other kind of non-drug related criminal markets that we've already discussed. So, there's a lot to be done, but I think fundamentally, this cannot be about us against them, with the US, that Mexico are the bad guys, they're corrupting our children with drugs. Americans want those drugs. They demand those drugs. And that's why Latin America works so hard to get them there. So we need to take a more realistic approach, I think, to the dynamics at play in all countries in the region.
Do you think that you mentioned a little bit civil society, and also that these organizations are very male heavy in their hierarchical structure? And this seems to me is always a little bit of an underreported issue. The role of women in Latin America in general, or the position of women in society and their treatment. I think it differs strongly from the United States as well as Europe. I think there are some issues that don't gather the attention they might deserve.
I agree. I mean, throughout the region, macho attitudes, or the suppression, or the inaccessibility of power to many women as a result of social attitudes towards them is a characteristic of the region. A lot of that is related to the use of violence, be that domestic violence, sexual violence. The Me Too movement has had certainly an impact across the region, where a lot of women are finally talking about, their everyday experience in the workplace, their everyday experience on the streets, which so far has simply been ignored or accepted by these communities and societies, which I think is really positive. But a lot of that has really been confined to, middle class groups within countries. I would argue that perhaps the greatest sufferers of discrimination against women in the region are poor, marginalized, brown, indigenous women, who very often are married off at the age of 12. They have a baby every year of their lives. They aren't educated. They aren't given the opportunities to thrive. And that has a cyclical effect. You have also seen, as in Mexico, as in around the world, women are coming into the job market more than they were 10 or 15 years ago. That has also had an incremental effect on the involvement of women in organized crime, less in leadership, but definitely in the ranks of, the lower level ranks of organized crime. But yes, I think there's still so much for them to fight for. But it's difficult to fight for those rights in a country that represses you and kills you and discriminates against you. Young men are still overwhelmingly the victims of violence in Mexico, but there are different types of violence that affect women. They're called feminicidios, which are basically sort of hate crimes against women. And that is also a huge problem around the country. So, yeah, I mean, you have seen more women becoming prominent in politics and what have you. But there's still a very, very long way to go in that respect.
I mean, it also seems that it's almost a cultural divide running through Mexico. I think recently abortion was legalized in Mexico City, but it is still illegal in other provinces. So there is, even in this, which I think is still a very contested topic, even there's not a uniform policy across Mexico, with some regions seemingly resisting it and other regions being more liberal in that respect.
Yeah. Abortion was legalized in Mexico City some years ago. I think it was around 2007. But this year, last month, it was legalized as well in the state of Oaxaca, which is a southern state, very popular with tourists, but very indigenous, very marginalized and impoverished. which came as a pleasant surprise. Those are the only two states in Mexico where abortion is legal. And you've seen that drive some states to the other extreme. There are parts of the country where women are in prison on homicide charges for having had miscarriages, which the law has decided were provoked abortions. And of course, if you go further south in Central American countries like El Salvador and Honduras, there is a complete ban on abortion under any circumstances, whether that be rape or sexual abuse, or if the fetus is a danger to the mother's life. There is no abortion under any circumstances. And those are some of the most draconian laws in the world. So I think there's also a lot of, this is a very Catholic region. A lot of the organizations that work in Latin America on the right and represent, religious values, a lot of them are funded and supported by organizations of that ilk that have a lot more money in the United States. And they've been very strong in lobbying against abortion throughout the region. You do see a slow change of attitudes. As you would expect, attitudes in Mexico City are more liberal than in other parts of the country. But still, given that, a lot of people in Mexico City might not be in agreement with that law. But, we pass laws to change attitudes and change social situations. So I think it is having the effect that it was intended to have. What you do see is a lot of women come from other states in the country to have abortions and terminations in Mexico, because it's the only way that they can access safe abortions. And obviously, if you put yourself in the hands of someone who's going to give you a backstreet abortion, you are putting your life at risk. And the women who are disproportionately affected by the prohibition of abortion throughout the region are poor, marginalized women. If you are a middle-class woman with access to private health, you can probably get a termination any way you want. So that's a huge factor as well. So it's a slow fight. Sort of sometimes it feels like it's 2 steps forwards and then 1 step back. We are seeing promising signs in Argentina and other countries around the region where the laws are being reconsidered. So, the struggle continues.
Do you think one of the disadvantages countries like Mexico or the broader Latin American region has is that they are, to a certain extent, much more diverse societies, right? You have a much larger indigenous society than the United States have. Then you had a different kind of colonialism taking place than what happened farther north. The kind of this legacy is still at the root of some of the issues that politically befuddle the region.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, with Mexico, it's especially complex because of the United States being so close. So you have sectors of society that are very aspirational, that look to America, that love America, that aspire to be like Americans. One example, you have Halloween coming up, and Mexico's very famous and lovely festival, Day of the Dead, or I think it's All Saints Day in some parts of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And in schools you have this, Halloween is starting to displace Day of the Dead for a lot of kids when it's not their festival. Day of the Dead is their festival, but it's to do with this aspirational culture, this admiration of the Americans over and above Mexico's own cultural values. But it's very schizophrenic. So you get that in certain pockets of white middle-class Mexican society. But then Mexico's cultural identity is also absolutely intrinsically linked to its indigenous roots. And that's very present in the way that Mexico presents itself, I think, on the world stage and how it recognizes itself. Then again, there is kind of a contempt and a desprecio, like there is a tendency to look down on that part of the population and consider it uneducated, ignorant, unsophisticated, and to be dismissive about it. And obviously, when you look at politics and who's empowered, The educated white middle class and upper class elites are obviously much more visible, as is around the world. I mean, Mexico's no exception in that sense. So I think it's something that Mexico struggles with a lot in terms of its identity and the way that it's moving forward as a nation. So I don't know. I mean, we'll see. There are certain. I think the internet has changed things, and social media has changed things because it's made parts of Mexico which are rural and provincial and out of the public eye infinitely more visible. But there are lots of different Mexicos, you know.
And I think that's the issue, right? It's even for a Mexican patriot, I assume that the patriotism comes with much more ambiguities than maybe for somebody who's an Austrian patriot or in the United States, because the idea of the nation is, even if it's imagined, is much clearer than in the case of Mexico or other Latin American states.
Yes. And I think nationalism is very encouraged here. It doesn't come with the same sort of negative right-wing connotations that it might have in the European countries. But it's complicated, you know. It's like, what does it mean to be Mexican? I think that differs enormously depending on where you were born and what you look like.
So as a concluding question, with the new government now in power in Mexico, do you think it will be more move into the, that's always of course difficult to say, but will it be more like kind of move in the right direction that pushes Mexico forward, or do you think that it at the end it will be more problematic? So do you think it is a positive development or a negative development?
I think it's too early to tell with Andres Manuel, because his first year, you know, you've seen the economy is stagnating. Business people who I speak to just can't really say anything good about him. I think things have slowed down and stagnated. The homicide rates are through the roof, higher than we've seen since the drug war began in 2006, 2007. You've seen him make a big statements and big gestures against fighting corruption and fighting crime, which are positive. I've yet to see that struggle has had any real impact yet on those problems. What Andres Manuel does have, which other presidents that I've seen here in the last decade haven't had, is a real rapport with El Pueblo, which roughly translated means, like, you know, as Pope said, like the common people, like people who are not empowered and who are not in elite schools and who are not necessarily working in offices. And these are the masses, you know, and Andres Manuel has always had a very strong rapport with them, and that popularity persists even when his policies and rhetoric are questionable and at times simply don't make sense. There are some worrying signs. He is centralizing power. He has been very hostile towards the press and its criticism of him, when obviously he embraced it when he was a campaigning candidate. And I think the comparisons to what, you know, people here worry that we're going to see happen in Mexico, what we've seen happen in Venezuela. I don't think those comparisons are fair. We haven't seen the nationalizing of industries. We haven't seen those kinds of sweeping reforms that kind of drive out business. But people are certainly worried, and there's still a certain amount of breath being held to see how this is going to pan out, because obviously, you know, he has a 6-year administration. We're just 1 year in, so there's still a lot to play for. There's still a lot that can change, and it's too early to tell how certain policies are going to impact.
So then I hope we can talk again in 2 years and kind of make a halftime assessment of his presidency.
Yeah, we should. I mean, he's certainly been very strong in terms of creating, stipends and grants for the poor, trying to create new employment opportunities. That's definitely been his rhetoric. I couldn't tell you how that's playing out on the ground yet, but, you know, in a couple of years' time, we should have more of an idea.
Okay, well, Deborah, thank you so much. This was amazing. I'm very excited. I'll send you a link as soon as the audio is ready. But from what I can tell, I think I don't think there's going to be much to be cut out.
Okay. All right. Let me know when it's up.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
Great speaking to you. Bye.